So, like I said, today we're jumping into Nehemiah chapter 8, but the flavor of this sermon today is Vision Sunday. It is the full picture of all of what we have in store for us today and the year ahead. And I love Vision Sundays. I love a chance to just kind of slow down and remind ourselves who we are as a church, what is important to us, what ought to be important, and then to dream a little bit together about the year ahead. So we have this thing in the Presbyterian Church where we kind of operate January, February, and then March, we really kind of settle into some time together in this way, and I'm grateful for it. So thanks for participating in the worship service, in the AGM, like in the meeting after, whether you are live, as it's happening online in person here today, or whether you take the time to go back and watch some of the presentations. It is just a good opportunity for us to talk about what matters most. And I actually, I've got to admit, today, or in leading up to today, I actually went back and forth a little bit on whether or not we would stay in Nehemiah explicitly and chapter 8, or if we would go and find some other passages to kind of help point us in a direction for the year. And as I was thinking about it, as I was praying about it, as we were preparing for this meeting and this day and all of sort of what the year ahead is going to hold, I really thought it would be good for us to settle into the series. It's no coincidence that we've been talking through this series called Rebuilding as we've been working toward the AGM and as we've been talking about the year ahead, because we are at a critical stage in our congregation, in our church's life. And Nehemiah has been a good lens through which to ask some difficult questions. Right? We've been able to ask questions like, why does the church exist? What really is the mission of the church, right? What do we have? What's the task that is placed before us? Who does the church exist to serve? Is what we're doing in line with the mission of God in the world? We've been able to ask these difficult questions through this lens and really kind of settle into reflecting on who we are and who we will continue to be. As I said, it's a critical time for us as a church, and whether this is your first Sunday or your 100th Sunday or math that goes beyond, that, it's crucial because we are able to return now, as we're able to return now to many of the in-person things that we left behind in 2022. It's important that we don't simply return to the way things were. It's important that we don't simply return to the way we want things to be. And many of us have been away from in-person worship, for example, like just what we do on Sunday, for almost 2 years, and some 2 years and counting. And so my hope really is that is going to allow us to try some new things as we return, as we rebuild. And so my prayer has been, and will continue to be, that this year ahead is a year of creativity. Many of you will know 2020 and 2021 were years of innovation and creativity because we had to. Right? If you were involved in any area of life, you had to change the way you did things just simply to survive. This year might be the first year, and this is why I'm excited in a few, right? Where we get the chance to be creative with ministry because we want to be, because we believe we're called to be. So as I began looking at Nehemiah 8 and thinking and praying right about our year ahead as a church, it did become clear to me that we ought to settle into chapter 8 of Nehemiah. And it's for a very specific reason. Nehemiah 8 is all about celebration. It's all about learning to celebrate again. And so I actually want to begin with verse 12. It says this, "Then all the people went away to eat and drink and to send portions of food and to celebrate with great joy." See, the wall at this point in the rebuild, as we've been studying through Nehemiah's return to Jerusalem and his task to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem for the people to provide a safe place for them to live, the wall is rebuilt at this point. Everything Nehemiah and the people have been working toward is complete. There was external opposition, but Nehemiah and the people pushed through. They pushed against the external opposition, and they kept building. There was conflict, and we saw internal opposition. We saw distraction. We saw injustice. And Nehemiah and the people stayed committed to the vision. They addressed the injustice, and then they continued rebuilding the wall. You may say, well, great, that's great for Nehemiah, right? It's great for Nehemiah and the people. It's great for Jerusalem. They have something to celebrate. They have something to enjoy. I maybe feel like I don't have anything to celebrate right now in 2022. I mean, maybe you're sitting there thinking, listen, like we just barely made it through the pandemic, whatever that means. Finances are all over the place. Relationships are broken. They need mending. Family and friends have died. We've lost loved ones. There's nothing in my life worth celebrating. And it does. We've got to admit, it does seem like over the last 2 years there hasn't been much to celebrate. And I don't know about you, but I want to celebrate again. I want to learn to celebrate again. I want there to be something worth looking back on and celebrating. And so the question, I think, for us as we think about the year ahead and as we think about what we are willing to give to that year, whether it's energy or money or time, is this: what will it take? What would it take to look back on 2022, a year from now, and to celebrate? What is it going to take? What is it going to require of us in order to celebrate? Nehemiah and the people in Jerusalem had something to celebrate. They did. But as I've read through Nehemiah and as I reread through Nehemiah and even this chapter, I don't think it's exactly what we would assume. See, the return from exile to Jerusalem and the surrounding areas happen in these waves. There's multiple waves. There's about like 3 waves of return. There's a word that maybe we're never going to use again. Wait. There's 3 waves of return to Jerusalem. And so we haven't covered this in the series. But first there's Ezra. Ezra is a priest. Ezra returns to Jerusalem with some people from exile, and Ezra rebuilds the temple. Stage 1. And then Nehemiah returns with more people and sees the walls are destroyed, and Nehemiah rebuilds the walls. The people rebuild the walls. And then we get to chapter 8. And in chapter 8, what we're going to see in a minute is that Ezra and Nehemiah come together. The priest, the spiritual leader, and the governor, the political leader, they come together, and with the people, God begins to rebuild the people. It's the 3rd phase of rebuilding. And it's only then that the people learn to celebrate again. It's only as God rebuilds them that they learn to celebrate. In July of this past year, I decided to run every single day of the month. 31 days. Every single day. Don't do it. Don't do it. My toenails fell off. Like seriously, 7 of them. It was terrible. Whenever you're trying to accomplish something dumb like that, or significant, and let's focus on accomplishing something significant, it's important that you have structure in place around you to help you succeed. In June, when I set the goal for July, like I'm going to run every day, I don't know what's going to happen, I put certain things in place to help me accomplish that goal. I did a couple of specific things. First, I decided that the distance didn't matter. I didn't care if I was going to run like 100 kilometers or 31 kilometers or 3 kilometers. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that I put on my running shoes and I put on my running clothes and I got out and I ran. Those were smaller goals in view of accomplishing the bigger goal. Some days I ran 10 kilometers, some days I ran to the mailbox. Like, all that mattered was that I got out and did it. When you're trying to achieve any goal, there are always going to be smaller actions, steps, that help us reach the larger goal. In the world, it's called scaffolding. It makes sense. I mean, at least it makes sense to me. I don't know. Maybe somebody who deals with actual scaffolding might disagree. But their external structure that are designed, they're systems designed to support the work that we want to do. If you want to go to the gym in the morning, one of the goals, right, is simply put your shoes next to your bed so that in the morning when you wake up, you see them. If you want to drink water in the morning before you drink a cup of coffee, which I don't know why anybody would want to do that, but the smaller goal is you set it beside the coffee pot. You drink your water as you make your coffee. There's small steps and like silly, small little things, but that actually have a big impact in the whole direction that you're going. If you don't want to watch Netflix in this mindless, endless binge loop at night, program your Wi-Fi to shut off at a certain time so that, bam, like done. At 10 o'clock, done. You got to go to bed. Simple things, but they have a huge impact. Why is any of this important? I think that the picture we're given in Nehemiah, and maybe just the bigger sort of surrounding chapters and books, context, Ezra, Nehemiah, the return to Jerusalem, is a picture of scaffolding. What's the goal? What is the vision? The vision that God has for Israel is not simply a temple rebuilt. It's not simply walls rebuilt. It is a people rebuilt. It's people living fully alive. It's people living into their collective witness in the world. It's people becoming and being who they were created to be. All of that is the goal for Israel. And the wall and the temple are steps to get there. When Ezra returns and rebuilds the temple, it begins to rekindle the Israelites' love of God and heart for worship. And maybe it even turns their hearts and their minds toward God. It reestablishes God in God's proper place and them as the people of God. When Nehemiah returns and rebuilds the walls around Jerusalem, right, when he calls more people to help, it actually provides a safe place for them to live. And what we see happen at the end of chapter 7 and into 8 is that actually more people return because it is an established place now. They know that their homes are going to remain their homes. Both of those things, the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the wall, are important, crucial steps. But at the end of the day, they're just scaffolding for what God ultimately wants to do for the people of Israel, and that is to rebuild them as a people. And God, I believe, wants to rebuild you and us as a people. That's the vision. That's where God has this thing going. It's not to build bigger buildings. We're going to have a little bit of work to do on this building eventually. It's not to build walls. Thank God there's no wall around this building. It's to rebuild people. It's to rebuild lives. It's to remind people that they are deeply and desperately loved by their Creator. And in Nehemiah, we're given this picture of God rebuilding the people. This is how it happens. Ezra opened the book, starting in verse 5. We're going to read a few verses down to 12 or so. Ezra opened the book. This is the priest. All the people could see him because he was standing above them on like maybe the world's first pulpit. I don't know. As he opened it, that is the book of the law, the people all stood up. Ezra praised the Lord, the great God, and all the people lifted their hands and responded, Amen, Amen. They're beginning to worship. They're beginning to praise God. Then they bowed down and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. They read from the book of the law of God, making it clear and giving meaning so that people understood what was being read. This is so important. That what we see happening here is not only is Ezra standing up and just being like, hey, here's the law, all of it, go and follow it. He's reminding Israel, he's reminding the people in Jerusalem who they are. In rereading the law, in rereading this contract between God and the people, it's to remind them not simply of all the rules to follow, but about why they existed in the first place. They understood what was being read. Then Nehemiah the governor, Ezra the priest and teacher of the law, and the Levites who were instructing the people said to them all, this day is holy, to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep, for the people had been weeping as they listened to the words of the law. And so you can kind of imagine maybe how this goes. So here are Israelites, here are the people who have come back from exile. They were in exile because they had abandoned the law in the first place, a bunch of other reasons. They return, and then Ezra's reading the law again. They go, oh, this isn't how we're living. This isn't like we're not doing what we're supposed to do. And so their natural response is to mourn. And Nehemiah comes and Ezra comes, and they say, listen, like, this is not a day to mourn. It's not a day to get caught up in all of the ways you've failed. It's not a day to get caught up in everything you're not. It's a day to remind us and to remind you of who you are. Then all the people went away, it says, to eat and drink, to send portions of food. That's a great little aside. They end up sending portions of food so that everybody can celebrate. No matter who they were or how much they had or didn't have, they send portions of food so that everybody can celebrate together. They celebrate with great joy because they now understood the words as they had been made known to them. The people learn to celebrate. See, as I read the story of Nehemiah, so we get, Nehemiah seeing this vision of a wall that is in crumble, like in shambles, and a people, like the words that are used there is disgrace and ruin. And Nehemiah returns, he rebuilds the wall, but he doesn't just do it himself. He calls people to action and to work and to build in a certain direction. And then it's accomplished. They actually do what they said they were going to do, what they set out to do. And it's just at that moment where you'd think there'd be cause to celebrate that God turns around and kind of goes, and there's one more thing for you. To reclaim them as his own people, to remind them that they belong to a loving God. For Israel, it's important for us to notice that the rebuild isn't just complete when the wall is finished. The wall is a step in the direction of God rebuilding the people. And when they do turn to celebrate, the celebration isn't in their own accomplishments. The celebration isn't in the look how many stones we stacked one on top of the other. The celebration isn't in the wall that's complete. It's in what God is doing, still doing in their midst. I want to celebrate what God is doing in and through our church. I want us to celebrate what God is doing in and through one another. The baptisms, people finding community, living into their calling, who God has made them to be, experiencing life, knowing joy, all of these things that happen when God steps in and starts rebuilding a people. But that type of vision is going to require some hard work and some difficult conversations. It's going to require change. It's going to require sacrifice. It's going to require of me, and it's going to require of you. My mom is an artist. She didn't know she was going to be in this sermon. I maybe should have told her. She paints. She paints these amazing abstract landscapes. And I can picture what a beautiful painting looks like. I can envision something in my head. I can, picture all of the things that are necessary to accomplish it, to, put pen to canvas and actually see it through. It's a completely different thing altogether to see that painting accomplished, to see it done, to see it finished. It requires a lot of work. This year is going to be a year about taking necessary steps to see a vision completed, to live into who God has called us to be, to reach our community, to introduce people to Jesus, to rebuild. If we are going to look back on 2022 and celebrate what God has done, we need to ask ourselves if we are ready for God to rebuild us. If we're ready for God to change us. Not to become the people we want to be. The hope of the gospel isn't to become more of who or what you want to be, but to become the people and to become the church that God needs us to be in our communities, for our communities. I want to wrap up this morning by spending just a little bit of time talking about the scaffolding that I think we have in place as the church. The mission of the church hasn't changed. You're not going to hear me jump up here, any day and say that the mission of the church is changing. The mission of the church is set. It's always been. It's always been discipleship in church language, discipleship and evangelism. In other words, growing as followers of Jesus, that's discipleship, and introducing people to Jesus, it's evangelism. Just because the mission stays the same, though, that doesn't mean that our methods need to. And so in each of these areas of ministry, and we're going to see them in a minute, we are going to experience change in the year ahead. And in some of them, we already have. It has been a couple years of change. You've already been through it. So the 5 areas of ministry for us, that none of them are going to surprise you. The first is worship. The second are groups. All right, so we believe that we are a worshiping community. Core to who we are, fundamental to who we are as Christians, as followers of Jesus. We are called to worship together. We actually believe that in worship, God encourages us and challenges us and convicts us and builds us into the people that God needs us to be, right? We talked about gathering together in worship, being equipped in worship, so that we can be sent out in and through our worship. That's kind of the movement. We want and desire and long to be a church of groups. That is a church that lives in community. Andy Stanley says this. He says, life is better in circles than in rows. And that's a simple statement, but it is true. I would love for every single one of us to be involved in a group beyond just Sunday morning, a small group of people who gather together to encourage one another, to pray for one another, to grow together, to support. Like, here's a group that when something happens in your life, your first call is to pick up the phone or to open up a text message or an email and to reach out to that group. These are friends. These are fellow followers of Jesus. These are people who can love and support you. Number 3, families. That families are core to who we are as followers of Jesus. And I want you to hear this, that whether this is parents, whether this is, whether you are a child, whether it is grandparents and grandchildren and great-grandparents and great-grandchildren, whether this is the aunt and uncle who comes alongside a nephew or niece, whether this is the person who sits in, and there are many of you sitting in the pews who reach out to my kids when they're here. We would like and long and love to be a church that supports families, that has ministries all the way from nursery to, adulthood, and that supports caregivers to children. How do we encourage parents to be followers of Jesus and to raise their kids? Listen, I need advice. My kids are young. You see them bopping all over the place. It's chaos sometimes. How do we support families, regardless of what that family looks like? Okay? Church of families. Care, number 4. How are we going to be a church that comes along and supports one another in seasons that are difficult? And listen, nobody needs to preach on difficult seasons anymore. We've done that for 2 years, right? But there are seasons of life where you and me, we together, every single person is going to go through a season of life where you need a little bit extra care. And so how are we going to build systems and supports and groups that intentionally care for every single person who comes through our doors, who are in our community? How are we going to offer support to our community? And finally, mission and outreach. How are we going to be a church that has a heart for the world and that works practically to serve our neighbor? How are we going to be and become a church that loves those in our community and that encourages support and prayer and work globally? Those are it. They're 5. They're not new. There's no rocket science here. But there are 5 that I think matter. These are our scaffolding. Because none of them, in and of themselves, matter on their own as the goal to attain or achieve. They position us to be ready for God to do what God is going to do, both in our lives, in our church, and in the world. They're not in any hierarchical order, right? But as individuals and as a community, these are the things that we need in place in our lives in order to position us for God to rebuild us. They direct our energy. They direct our minds. They direct our resources. Ultimately, they create a culture and an environment in which we are ready for God to move. When Israel returned from exile, they weren't ready for God to rebuild them as a people. They needed to be reminded of their identity as a worshiping people, and so the temple was rebuilt. They needed the practical safety and certainty that their homes wouldn't be destroyed, so the wall was rebuilt. And it's at that point that God said, okay, you are now ready. You're now ready for me to rebuild you. As we rebuild in these 5 areas strategically this year, intentionally this year, God is going to remind us of who we are. And we are going to become increasingly positioned for God to change our hearts, but maybe even more importantly, we are going to become increasingly positioned to reach our community and to help God change their hearts. Here's the vision. We are going to rebuild together, and we are going to reach together our community, and my prayer ultimately is the worlds that we occupy around us. In every area of ministry, every program, everything that we are going to do, all of these included, we are going to ask this question: how are we rebuilding so that we can continually reach people far from God? How are we growing as followers of Jesus so that we can participate in what God is doing in the world? And my prayer, again, hear this, throughout this entire year, is that as we do, as we rebuild, as we allow God to rebuild, as we become strategic about how we are doing our ministries, that we would learn again to celebrate what God is doing. So in a second, I'm going to close in prayer, but what I would love for you to think about, just in a really practical, really simple way, is this. Write down these 5 areas of ministry. Write down these 5, or just, maybe some of you have better memories than me. Memorize them. But here's the prayer that I want you praying. Ask God which areas he's calling you to serve in. Ask God which areas get you excited about participating in the life and ministry of the church. Ask God what gifts you might have to contribute in one of these areas or more. It's not about being a super Christian. It's not about checking off the box. We were I participate in worship and groups and families and care, but it's not about check marks and a box beside the list. It's about allowing God to use you. It's about allowing God to rebuild you and build into you and encourage you to use your gifts and your abilities to serve in one of these areas. Let me pray.